In lesson 1, we spoke about how meditation is a tool to become aware of our conscious thoughts and to grow in control of them. And we explained how we can actually harness this idea to steer our feelings intentionally in a positive direction, which has a positive effect on our mood and our feelings. And not only that, but it has an impact beyond ourselves. This week's lesson, we are going to take it a step further. And if the last lesson was about investing our mind in tangible positivity, this lesson is going to teach us on how to elevate our thinking to uncover a spiritual awareness beneath this level of thinking. An even deeper level that we've spoken about up until this point. And so we will get right into it. On page 38, if you have the book open in front of you, there's an exercise. We got 2 questions. The first question is, how would you define spirituality? And how might spirituality be experienced? As we see in these 2 questions, tonight we're going to be discussing this exact idea of spirituality. So before we get into understanding what spirituality, take a moment and jot down, if you have a pen handy. If not, just think about it for a moment. The answer to these 2 questions. Jot down the answer to these 2 questions. If you feel comfortable, put it in the chat box for everyone to see. How would you define spirituality? And how might spirituality be experienced? Now, it's not surprising that there's no set definition for spirituality. They've actually done a survey, and researchers found that there are 27 different explicit definitions of spirituality among articles on the subject in medical journals, and there is little overlap between them. And why is that? Perhaps we can say that in life, we are surrounded by materialism. We live in a world that's dominated by materialism. We're physical beings. Our body senses are only aware of tangible material input. Everything we see, everything we hear, everything we feel is physical. And on top of that, society places a tremendous emphasis on material gain and success, that we begin to define that as the be-all, end-all of existence. And living a normal lifestyle, that's actually expected. It's only natural that we identify with our material needs and drives, and by extension, we see the world through that lens, which is anchored in the physical nature of reality. Which brings us to an interesting point, and that is that some people don't feel a sense of spirituality at all. They claim they can't see it, they can't feel it, it doesn't exist. Other people do have a certain sense, a certain feeling, an intuitive sense of spirituality, but they don't know exactly what it is. They know there's more to life. They acknowledge that there's a spiritual side to themselves. It's not part of their average mindset. Some people experience sunset, sunrise. They feel this exhilarating sense of spirituality, of depth, the birth of a child, a different life-altering experience, and they feel that there's some sort of spirituality. And some people find comfort in their faith of God and belief in the justice of the world. All of these experiences point in the direction that there is something beyond the physical makeup of the universe, but these fleeting experiences are just that. They're fleeting experiences, and even then most people can't pinpoint what they are experiencing. On a day-to-day basis, most of us are caught up with our material needs and concerns, and we can't seem to identify with anything spiritual. Granted, there are people that are very spiritual people, and they should be commended for that, but we're talking about the majority of people. And the question really is it possible for us to develop a real sense of something that is beyond the material? If that is possible, how can we develop a sensitivity to spirituality? And what even is spirituality? And that's what we are going to explore in this lesson, the nature of spirituality. We're going to do that by discovering the inner spiritual seeker within each of us, believe it or not. We all have it. And by developing a sense of what it means to experience spirituality. And thank you for those who placed it in the chat box. We have some ideas of what would you define spirituality, and how might spirituality be experienced. We can define spirituality by selflessness and selfness, and to be natural is a way we can experience it. Spirituality is non-measurable reality. Okay, these are both, all three are valid ideas, and we'll see how that fits into what we will be discussing tonight, but perhaps we're going to get a slightly different understanding of what spirituality is and how to experience it. Now, they say the story that for his 70th birthday, the Zen master was given by one of his students a huge box with a big bow on it, a big ribbon, and it was wrapped with wrapping paper. And the Zen master opens the box and he sees that there's nothing inside, and he says, aha, this is exactly what I wanted. So what is spirituality, and how do we gain from it? We'll begin by where everything truly begins, and that is at home with ourselves. Because that's where it starts. It starts inside ourselves. Because to appreciate spirituality with the world around us, we must first identify it within ourselves. We began with the assumption that we are material beings in a material world, and as such, we sense spirituality to be distant and an elusive concept. Is that really the case? Let's think about it for a moment. How well do you know yourself? Think about different ideas that accurately describe you. Each one of us, when thinking about ideas that describe ourselves, we're going to include obvious descriptions that are less personal, technical details about ourselves. Gender, even less personal, our job, where we live, right? Angelinos, some people's just where they live, other people's it's actually their personality. Various other material-oriented descriptions. And then your description of yourself will probably include also spiritual and meaningful descriptions that are more spiritually inclined. Things that are unprovable, many of them, or unquantifiable. You clearly identify with some form of spiritual depth within yourself. But what is the spirituality within ourselves? Let's take a look at text 1, page 40, right at the beginning of creation. Page 40, text 1. The verse from the creation of humanity. God formed the human from the dust of the ground, and he breathed into the human's nostrils the soul of life. What is unique about this verse? For those who are familiar with the account of creation, you'll notice something interesting. And that is a difference between the way humans are created and the way all other creations were created. I don't know if PETA will appreciate this, but see, the way animals were created, the way birds were created, the way all mammals aside from humans, all birds, all fish, all beings really, even stones, the inanimate, the vegetative, all beings aside from humans were created in a single stage, a singular organism of the body and soul. Not so the human being. When God created the human, first God formed the body, as it says in the verse, God formed the human from the dust of the ground, following which there was a second stage of creation of humankind, breathing a soul into that body, which led to something that we have told today, and that is we each have two distinct personas within the human being, within ourselves. We have a body-oriented nature and a soul-oriented nature. And we can operate on multiple levels of consciousness with different and often conflicting priorities and drives. Body consciousness is something we are all too familiar with. This is the basic side of the human being, that we want to eat, that we want to sleep, that we want to feed our own interest by having pleasure, earning honor, trying to survive, perpetuating ourselves. Our bodies are formed from the earth, and therefore they're naturally drawn toward materialistic and physical pursuits. And like all physical things, like all materialistic things, they're hardwired to perpetuate their own self. And so if we can sum it up, our body consciousness, which comes from our bodies, it lives in the here and now and seeks and feels gratification from the material gain. That is the first persona, the body-oriented nature of the body consciousness. And we'll come to this in a moment. In Kabbalistic terminology and in Hasidic parlance, it is called the nefesh habahamis, the animalistic soul, the base body-oriented body consciousness. What's the soul consciousness? The soul consciousness, if you recall in lesson 1, we had that map. We had that map where we looked at the soul and we learned that it has the intellectual and emotional functions of the soul. But that's actually the secondary step of the soul. The soul is deeper than that entire map that we had in lesson 1. Let's pick up the metaphor that we had last week of a cell phone, a smartphone. A smartphone has multiple levels to it, right? We said it has the hardware of the smartphone itself. It has the apps, the software that you put on the phone, and then you have the interface, which is what we focused on last week. That interface, the screen, the fact that there's a program, the operating system that enables us to benefit through the hardware to benefit from the software. That's what we discussed last week on how we shouldn't work. Well, we ought to, we just explained last week that we ought to work on changing the software, the essence of it, but that can take a lifetime. The way we got to work on it on a simple baby steps was by working on the interface, on the operating system, on the thought process, which is what we spoke about last week. But let's take that a step further. The phone itself, the hardware, the actual phone, is a lot more than just apps. It's a complex piece of hardware that's able to contain within it various software that's installed within it. The soul has within it 10 operating mechanisms, but it itself is something beyond, something deeper than those functions of the intellect and the emotion. As we say in the morning prayers in text 2 on page 40, Every morning we say in our prayers, Elokai neshama shenosata bi, my God, the soul that you placed within me is pure. You created it, you formed it, you breathed it into me. When the prayer, you breathed it into me, is paraphrasing the verse that God breathed the soul into it, it doesn't mean literally God breathed. God doesn't breathe. God, any anthropomorphic qualities which are ascribed to God throughout the Torah is in order for us to understand, to relate somewhat to what we are talking about, but not, God forbid, that there are any such anthropomorphic qualities that God possesses literally. God doesn't have a hand, God doesn't have a foot, as it were, but nonetheless, the verse occasionally refers to God's outstretched arm, which is really just a metaphor for us to relate to it. And the same with breathe it into me. God didn't literally breathe it into us, but it takes on a similar level for us to relate to it on our level of understanding. Be it as it were. So we see here that the divine soul is something deeper. There is this essence to it that is associated with God. What is the soul? The soul is a pristine spiritual force. It's pure, it's transparent to its divine origins. It's a part of God, as it were. And what does it want? It wants to live for something greater than itself. The soul is the voice that drives us to seek meaning and purpose, and the soul senses the spirit of everything in life. But the soul is deeper than a search for meaning. Spirituality is more than a search for meaning, and the identity of the soul is deeper than that. What is spirituality? What is the identity of the soul? So one way of appreciating the essential spiritual core nature of the soul in its purest sense is by envisioning a flame. Why a flame? Because the flame is a metaphor which is utilized by Scripture itself to understand the soul. Text 3, page 41. Verse in Proverbs chapter 20. The human soul is the candle of God. Now take a moment to look at the screen. Look at the flame. Right? When you see a flame, the flame is constantly going upward. There's a wick, there's a fire, there's the wax or the oil, whatever situation type of flame there is. There are many ways that we can imagine a flame serving as a metaphor for the human soul. And there are many ways in Kabbalah that it explains this association of this verse in Proverbs. So we're going to focus on one. Text 4. Shmuel, can you please read for us text 4 on page 42?
Just 42. Okay, the flickering of the soul. The nature of a flame is to flicker upward, indicating that the flame intrinsically seeks to part from its wick in order to unite with its source above. Similarly, the human soul naturally desires and yearns to separate itself and escape its body in order to unite with its origin and source in God, the blessed source of all life.
Thank you. So the soul is like a candle because the soul is constantly jumping upward. The flame of a candle always goes upward. Turn a candle upside down, and the flame is still going upward. The soul also is always going upward. The soul is non-material and really wants to connect with a truth that is beyond our senses and beyond reason. It's made of something totally different than the materialistic body, and it doesn't relate to our materialistic world at all. The soul desires to rise above and to leave, to transcend the corporeal body, to connect with God. This is the purest awareness of the soul. Understanding the soul's identity provides us with a definition of spirituality. And that is, spirituality is an awareness of the divine presence that is beyond the material surface of reality. And this is how our souls naturally see the world. And if we were able to live in line with our souls, we'd see the world this way by default. We'd see the divine presence beyond the material surface of reality. That is how our soul lives. That is what the soul sees. That is spirituality. Seeing the divine presence that is beyond the material surface of reality. But that's not the default consciousness. The default consciousness is our material desires, our material drives. They're in front of us constantly, and the body's physical needs are immediate and urgent. That's why our default way of functioning is driven by the material needs, by materialism. And on a day-to-day basis, that is the identity that we embody. We don't identify with the spiritual soul, and most of us don't relate to the description of the spiritual seeking soul that we just learned about. We don't. Most of us. Some of us do. Most of us don't. Sometimes we feel something spiritual, but even when we feel something spiritual, we feel this urge for meaning and depth. We appreciate art and we feel and we sense love, etc. They're only hints of the soul peeking out within the physical life. We can term these experiences relative spirituality, if you will, because they give us literal spiritual depth in our material lives. But to feel spirituality on its own, to feel the yearning of the soul to leave the material world and to connect with the source of life, to connect with God, is something that may seem foreign and difficult to identify with. And that's why we have a hard time with it. It doesn't come to us naturally. But now that we understand spirituality, we understand what it is, now we can take the next step of attempting to experience it. We'll take a moment to follow a guided meditation on this concept of the body and the soul, and to appreciate that we each have a soul within us.
We have two voices speaking to us from within. One voice is our lower order self, Nefesh Bahamis. The Nefesh Bahamis urges us to live a life of pleasure, of ease. getting what we want whenever we want it. The other voice is the voice of the Nefesh Elokis. That's our godly self. That's the self that seeks connectedness with people in love, connectedness with the world and its elements, feeling fulfilled, connectedness with Hashem. Gently close your eyes and just become aware of your inner self, your inner quiet, that place you can escape to, because it's always a place where you have your own sense of self. Allow that special place to be your refuge, that place of inner sanctity, totally protected, always safe. As you step out of that space, become aware of your two inner voices. Listen to the voice of the Nefesh Bahamis. Note what it tells you. It says, you're insecure in this world. You need to shore yourself up. You need more and more and more. Otherwise, you're unsafe. Build walls around you. Wealth. Create superficial pleasures, because life is short. The Nefesh Bahamis is the voice of the ego. Now listen to the truer voice of the Nefesh Elokis, the voice that tells you that everything possesses truth and meaning, that your happiness and joy comes from connecting truly to people, to the world around you, by connecting to the inner selves, the soulful center. The voice that tells you pleasure doesn't come from material acquisition. It comes from the smile of appreciation for having helped someone, for the small gift that you give your grandchild, for the blue sky that you wake up to. In life, choose which voice you are going to listen to. It may be that you don't need to have a battle within, a fight between them. You might even be able to transform the Nefesh Bahamis into an ally, giving its energy the capacity to do the right things. But always allow yourself to recognize that your true voice is the voice of the Nefesh Elokis. In so doing, your life will be replete with happiness and fulfillment.
They say a story that the spiritual guru arrives on the streets of New York, and he sees a hot dog stand, one of those wonderful yellow hot dog stands on the corners of New York. He obviously wasn't Jewish, because if he was, he'd make sure it was a kosher one. Perhaps it was. And he sees a hot dog stand. So he says, all right, how much is a hot dog? $4.99. I'll take one hot dog with everything on it. Put everything on it, and he hands the vendor a $20 bill. He hands the vendor a $20 bill, and the vendor takes the 20, puts it in the cash register, and closes it and moves on to the next customer. The guru turns to the vendor and he says, excuse me, sir, where's my change? The vendor says, aha, change. Change has to come from within. Now that we understand the duality that is within us, we can appreciate that to open ourselves spirituality, to open ourselves to spirituality, we don't need to add anything. We don't need to look for anything. We don't need to go and gather something. All we need to do is to look inside ourselves and become aware of our spiritual seeking souls. We're already spiritual seekers. We just don't know it. Now, our inner spiritual soul is silenced by the outer materialism, by the outer material drives of the body. This, if so, spirituality is what? Is not addition, it's subtraction. It's to remove the outer layers of materialism, is to remove ourselves of the body, so to speak. We need to subtract. We need to get to know the self that is beneath the material-oriented perspective that shapes our lives. That's what spirituality is about. This deep faith of innate spirituality, which is within every person, and the way to get to it is not through addition, but rather through subtraction, to strip away the surface layers of materialism, the surface layers of our identity that are driven by ego and materialism, and to uncover the spiritual awareness that is already within us, brings us to an ancient Jewish meditation practice called hitbodedut. Like we discussed last week, there are 3 levels. We're going to move on to this level called hitbodedut, or in Ashkenazic accent, hisbodedus. What is hitbodedut, hisbodedus? It comes from the root word badad. Badad. What does that mean? Badad means seclusion, aloneness. This form of Jewish meditation practice encourages a person to distance themselves from material distractions as a way to discover spirituality. As we see in text 5, articulated by Maimonides' son, whose name was Rabbi Avraham, the son of Maimonides, and he writes as follows, text 5, page 43. Hitbodedut, seclusion is one of the most superior of all the distinguished practices. It is a practice of the greatest saints and the medium through which the prophets experienced revelation. Inner aloneness allows us to focus on spirituality. This seclusion is not a goal in its own right. This seclusion is other meditation techniques encourage a person to meditate in quiet solitude to maximize concentration and focus. That's not what this is. What this is, the focus of the solitude, the focus of aloneness here, is to experience an inner aloneness. Not only to move away from material distractions outside of you, but also to mentally move away from material distractions inside. Move away from your mind, move away from your feelings, move away from yourself as well. Because once a person is free from material input and stimulation, you're able to distance yourself internally from the material self-identification and to focus on your inner spiritual calling. Sages throughout the ages would practice this. As a matter of fact, as we see in text 6 on page 44, It's from the great sage, the Shalah, the great 16th century sage. He writes as follows. It is recorded in many of the works of the medieval rabbis that seclusion, this form of meditation, hitbodedut, separation from everything mundane and devotional clinging to God, were practiced by the pious Jews. This is to say that when they were alone, they would empty their minds of all worldly concerns and connect their minds with the master of all existence, with God. The famed Kabbalist, the Arizal, taught that this practice is far more beneficial for the soul than study, and that every person should practice the seclusion meditation according to their ability, either once a week, once a fortnight, or at the very least, once a month. Because by being alone, a person is able to mentally transcend their lived experience to connect with something deeper. Once the body is silenced, the inner soul can be heard, and it can be harnessed for a spiritual meditation to connect with God and to be open to the possibility of experiencing a state of dveikus, as the Shalom mentions, which means literally clinging or devotional unification to God, with God. This is the ultimate spiritual experience, when one's soul is entirely free from the constraints of the body and is able to soar to spiritual heights to feel one with God. Now, in its purest form, this is a very, very advanced meditation method that, when practiced properly, has the power to totally shift a person's consciousness and elevate their awareness to that deeper level, the spiritual seeking soul level. But to be honest, this isn't something hitbodedut, this aloneness level of attempting to transcend oneself, to be entirely disconnected from one's materialistic focus, isn't something that I can recommend or talk about from personal experience. There were mystics throughout Jewish history who practiced this meditation technique to achieve spiritual enlightenment, to receive that level. And they'd harness this level of elevation to dive deep into their soul consciousness. And they were able to utilize at that point this spiritual level with the various tools and divine incantations that they knew to elevate their mental experience, to encounter mystical visions, and to have supernatural experiences. The issue is, however, that this form of meditative techniques, hitbodedut, seclusion, aloneness, allowing almost to lose ourselves, to find our deeper self, this method of subtraction, are very delicate and can be very physically and spiritually dangerous for those who aren't worthy of practicing them. To the extent, as you see on text 8, page 47, the Talmud cautions that they're not to be taught publicly, this form of meditation, and should only be transmitted to those who are spiritually fit for it. And the Talmud tells us on how careful we ought to be with this level of meditation. Text 8. Ella, can you read for us text 8 on page 47?
Four individuals enter the orchid. They explore the Torah's mystical secrets. They are Ben Azai, Ben Zoma, Archer, and Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai gazed at the divine presence and died. Ben Zoma gazed at the divine presence and became crazed. Archer gazed and chopped down the shoots of saplings. He became a heretic, and Rabbi Akiva emerged safely.
Thank you. So of the four great sages, says the Talmud, who pursued this path of transcendent mysticism, of hitbodedut to the extreme, to the full level of losing their outer self and traveling into that spiritual realm, the form of subtraction, only one escaped unscathed. The other three were affected negatively. Ben Azai, he died. He didn't make it out alive upon attempting this spiritual journey. Ben Zoma, another great sage, he became crazy, quite literally. He lost his mind. Acher was a great sage. He became a heretic from seeing what he saw. Only Rabbi Akiva, the great famed sage, was unharmed. And this concept is especially true in modern times, where we lost the precise spiritual formulas and we lack the spiritual sensitivity and ritual purity. In Kabbalah, it explains that this is associated with ritual purity, and therefore the practices are inaccessible to everyone. Now, for the most of us, even the preliminary steps of this meditation, just the idea of going into seclusion, of sitting quietly on the couch at home, sitting outside quietly and trying to forget about all our needs, trying to forget about everything materialistic and just think about something spiritual, or just to empty our minds and see what our soul will give us, isn't something which is easy to practice, and it probably won't lead to any experience of spiritual awakening. And that's for two reasons. Firstly, transcending our consciousness takes tremendous mental effort and training. It's not as simple as being alone and quiet. And it's inconceivable to master that throughout just our class or even our course. But more importantly, we can't experience our soul if we're unfamiliar with it. The practitioners of this level of Jewish meditation, the sages that did successfully practice this, were advanced spiritual masters with years of deep study of Kabbalah and practices related to that. And even once one manages to strip away the outer layer, the material-driven consciousness, one has to develop the soul's consciousness. Because otherwise you don't have a language for it to be experienced with. So if we're not able to simply tune out the materialistic side of ourselves and innately sense the divine, which is that first level of Jewish meditation, this higher level of hitbodedut, this higher level of just stripping away the outer level of body consciousness and allowing our innate spiritual consciousness to fill us and go through that great spiritual transcendence, then if so, we need another level. We need another channel to develop the spiritual perspective of the soul. Which leads us to the second meditation practice within Jewish tradition that doesn't aim to subtract from materialism, but rather it aims to nurture the soul's spiritual calling. And what is this level of meditation? This level of meditation is called hitbodedut. Now, they're closely related Hebrew words with their prefixes and suffixes, but it's a different word with a different root. Hitbodedut was the first one that we learned, which comes from the root word badad, alone. Hitbodedut comes from the root word bina, which means understanding. It's a cognitive, spiritual meditation. It means to understand. Hisbodedut in the Ashkenazic accent, hisbodedut is the practice of meditating on a concept or idea to deepen one's understanding and appreciation of that idea. So while hisbodedut, which comes from the root word badad, seeks to discover spirituality through disengaging, through subtraction, through disengaging with materialism or from one's body, hisbodedut, this latter form of Jewish meditation, which is rooted in the word understanding, seeks to discover spirituality through a hyper engagement with the soul, with spirituality, by meditating on the spiritual wisdom that forms the soul's spiritual awareness. So hitbodedut is a meditation to detach from material consciousness, and hitbodedut, this latter form, is a meditation to develop the awareness of the soul consciousness. Now, the reality is we do need a certain level of hitbodedut. We need a certain level of aloneness, because in order to have this hisbodedut level of meditation, this level of meditation, which is meditating on a spiritual concept to deepen our appreciation of it, it can be practiced independently of aloneness, of that former level of meditation, but it usually comes following it, even on a lower level, which we do ought to practice on a lower level, the level of hitbodedut, that level, that Jewish meditation practice of aloneness, we ought to practice on the lower level of it, not that great level of trying to attain that level of transcendence, of divine journey, but rather the idea of detachment from what's around us. It's kind of hard to have deep meditation on a concept to deepen our appreciation of it in the middle of Times Square. So we ought to find that place, go through that level of aloneness of Jewish meditation in that level, before we get to the understanding level, hitbodedut, but the level of hitbodedut by turning off the noise, externally going to a quiet place, and internally spending a few moments to try to focus on what we're about to do. What is hisbodedut? What is the second level of Jewish meditation? They say, what did one mindful meditator say to the other mindful meditator? Are you not thinking what I'm not thinking? What is this level of meditation? And this is really the goal of tonight's lesson, is to understand this level of meditation. And we're actually going to go through an example, an actual meditation utilizing this formula. See, we learned earlier that our souls are spiritual. They want to connect with the divine that is beyond our material world. They want to know God. They want to sense God's presence everywhere. They sense God's presence everywhere. Once we understand the outlook and perspective of the soul, and we appreciate what exactly it wants, and that is to connect with that level of the divine, it gives us a deeper appreciation, and will give us a deeper appreciation for what spirituality is, and it'll become a more dominant presence in our consciousness. Practically speaking, the first step in this direction to understand the soul, to understand this level of spirituality, is to study the spiritual wisdom of Kabbalah and Hasidic thought, to better understand the spiritual nature of the universe, because that's what forms the soul's perspective. But study alone is not enough, because just reading mystical texts won't change your thinking or deepen your soul awareness. That's where this comes in. It requires deep contemplation. Because since spiritual awareness goes against our surface level of consciousness, spiritual wisdom is abstract, it's foreign to our senses. Properly understanding and relating to the ideas takes deep contemplation and deliberate cognitive meditation. In the words of the previous Rebbe, text 9 on page 49, a central foundation of this study of mysticism is to repeatedly spend considerable time in deep contemplation on the subject matter being studied. This is the practice that is referred to as hitbodedut, which means to firmly visualize the concept and to analyze it deeply. So hitbodedut is disengagement from the body. Hitbodedut is hyper engagement with the soul. Let's deepen our understanding of the soul's perspective, which will enable us to shift our thinking and deepen our soul awareness. And how do we do that? By deep contemplation, which enables us to take it to the next level of meditation, of visualizing any given concept in order to analyze it deeply. In the words of one of the great early sages, text 10 on page 50. David, can you read for us text 10 on page 50? You have to unmute yourself.
All right.
Thank you. There we go. Text 10.
You shall take it to heart. This is a positive commandment to know God. We are enjoined to investigate and develop an appreciation of God's unity and not rely solely on received tradition. However, since the spiritual understanding of the divine is abstract and not easily understood, the verse emphasizes that we must, quote, take it to heart, unquote. The Hebrew term for take it in this verse more literally means return it, indicating that we must repeatedly contemplate the concept until it settles in our mind. The term take to heart always refers to a matter that requires profound concentration and extra focused thinking.
Thank you. So in other words, if we want these spiritual concepts to become deeply rooted in our thinking, to take root in our consciousness, we got to chew them over. We got to do it once, we got to do it twice. We have to have this deep level of contemplation where we have this idea of this meditation of hitbodedut, which is thinking deeply about this idea, visualizing it, breaking it down, analyzing it, and explore its applications and manifestations, which is why it says you shall take to your heart, but it uses the word of a hashevaisa, which means not just take it once, but you shall return to the heart. Do it once, do it again, do it a third time, do it again and again and again. This a deep contemplative meditation in order to visualize it and connect deeply with it. What does this help? This brings about the possibility to take abstract concepts and bring them to life. It takes us to take these aloof, abstract, mystical ideas and assimilate them into our minds and shape our thinking. Here's two texts that describe this meditation, 11a and 11b on page 51 and 52. First one is from the previous Rebbe, and the second one is from an article which kind of it makes it more relatable. 11a, hitbodedut is an internal dialogue with an idea. Once we have studied something well in all its fine details, explanations, and commentaries, until we have developed a thorough understanding of it, the practice of hitbodedut meditation, hisbodedut, is to then mentally analyze the idea to verify whether our understanding is true and accurate in all of its details. Through diligent meditation, we develop a strong visualization of the soul of the concept, which is the animating core of the idea itself. The Hasidic practice of hisbodedut meditation involves actively contemplating a spiritual concept until it expands our creative intelligence, deepens our awareness, and becomes an indelible part of our consciousness. You become affected by these ideas because when you visualize the subject, not just read it, not just think about it, but you visualize the subject, you engage with it deeply, mentally, you become affected and moved by it. When you deeply contemplate a spiritual idea, you visualize it, it becomes familiar to you, and it becomes part of your consciousness. And that automatically leads to a heightened spiritual awareness. The more we develop a real spiritual theology and philosophy of God through meditation, and we begin to appreciate God's presence in this world, the more real God is in our lives, and the deeper the soul's spiritual awareness is embedded in our very consciousness, which leads us to sense spirituality and feel an emotional closeness to God. Like it says in text 12 on page 52, through honest contemplation with deep focus, a person's soul develops an authentic closeness and attachment with God, commensurate to their spiritual standing. And through this, one fulfills the mitzvah to love God. As we've mentioned on multiple occasions, that the mitzvah to love God is a spiritual mitzvah. We touched upon it last week. How do we fulfill? How can there be a spiritual, a commandment for a feeling? But the idea is the commandment is to do the steps that bring about that feeling. And this is how we do it. This is how we attain that literal consciousness of the divine through this level of meditation. Through this Jewish meditation called hisbodedut, deep contemplation. What is it? What is the meditation? What are the steps that we ought to take? So take a deep breath, and here goes. We're going to practice a hisbodedut meditation all together. It's based on the nature of spirituality, which will enable us to develop a keen awareness of the divine and fuel the fire of the soul to experience a deep closeness to God. We're going to study a text from Hasidus, from the teachings of Hasidus, which is based on the wisdoms of Kabbalah. After we learn this idea together, I want you to jot down ideas that you take from this Hasidic text. One idea, 2, 3, 4, however many ideas, general themes you'll see in the text. Once we have a shared understanding of the body of the text, then we'll unpack the ideas and we'll practice a guided hisbodedut meditation, which will bring these concepts that we'll see in the text. It'll bring these concepts to life. It'll let them sink into our consciousness so we can begin to develop a concept of spirituality. Here it goes. The text we're going to study is a text from Rabbi Shalom Dov Ber Schneerson, the fifth Chabad Rebbe in the Rebbe Rashab from 1898. It's a long discourse. It's a discourse that was said over many, many months. It spans about 200 pages of tight writing in Hebrew, double-sided pages. But we're going to study an excerpt from that lengthy discourse. The theme of that talk is the inner dimension of repentance, of teshuvah, of repairing our relationship with God. But then there's this key idea that he explains, a little bit on the long side, but let's focus on it, and then we will break it down and unpack it. Heather, can you read for us text 13? The Hebrew's on page 54. I'm not sure what the English is on. I'm guessing 55. You have to unmute. We can't hear you. There we go.
Everything that exists is comprised of a physical form and a spiritual divine energy that creates and animates the entity's physical existence. This is clearly demonstrable in animals and humans. They have an animating spirit. If the spirit were to leave their body, the body would no longer be classified as alive, and the body would begin to decompose and turn to dust. That is because the very existence of the body hinges upon the spiritual energy that animates it. The same is true of vegetation. It also possesses an animating spirit. Even inanimate objects possess some sort of energizing spirit that keeps them in existence and prevents their disappearance. Based on this awareness, spirituality is referred to as good and life because it is a living force that remains alive and in existence forever. Whereas physical matter is referred to as negative and death because it decomposes and ceases to exist without the spirit within it, and it has no means of existing independently. From my flesh, I can perceive God, meaning that human experience informs our understanding of God. We intuitively sense that we have a life force that provides us with our life, and that it is our primary identity, and that were our soul to leave our body, the body would be left like an inanimate rock and eventually decompose and disappear. The same is true with all that exists. The entire cosmos and all its contents exist due to a divine spirit that gives existence to everything. That divine light and force is the entire life and sustaining power of all that exists. If it departs, all existence will revert to absolute nothingness. If we meditate on this idea, we will realize that the material existence of each entity is entirely dependent on the spiritual force within it, and that physicality is nullified before the presence of the divine light that is its source of existence. This realization will inspire a powerful desire, love, and yearning for the divine. We will no longer desire that which exists only superficially, and which is in fact death, decomposing and disappearing. All we will desire is to attach to the divinity that is true life and the mainstay of existence.
Thank you. So if we read this passage and we learn it peripherally, you'll find it interesting, somewhat compelling. Some may write it off as irrelevant, but it's a nice idea. But I doubt it would shift anyone's thinking. The idea is abstract, it's counterintuitive. Our brains can't compute it easily, and we don't readily relate to its central thesis. And so to see the world through the lens of this idea, this concept, that's where contemplative meditation comes in. The first step of contemplative meditation, once we read this idea, this spiritual concept, let's break it down into smaller ideas. And then following breaking it down, let's analyze them, chew them over until this teaching sinks in. Take a moment and jot down 3 ideas that this text teaches us. Don't post it in the chat box. Put down 3 ideas that you took from this text. Now, there's no right and wrong to what ideas you can take from this text. But to me, the 3 central ideas that are in this text are as follows. The first point is that everything, literally everything, has a divine spirit within, what we call the soul. That's the first idea I take from this text. The second central idea, the second big idea in this text is that this soul that's at the core of everything, this spiritual soul, is its source of life, of that item. Every items, everything, every being, everything that has this soul is its source of life. Which brings us to the third point, that since the spiritual content of everything is its core identity, that is what we should value. Think of it this way. There's a soul. This soul is what sustains the body. And therefore, we should identify with the soul. That may have been the ideas that you came up with. You may have come up with other ideas, but let's stick for now with these ideas. And let's focus on them. Let's dwell on them to develop them and flesh them out. What's the first idea? The first idea that everything has a divine spirit with it. Every single physical being has a soul. In living beings, the soul is clearly recognizable. Humans, animals, the soul is there. They have a conscious, a human being has a consciousness and an ability to think, to feel. There's obviously something more to us than the physical bones, muscles, and organs which animate us with life. And this can serve as a paradigm for all created beings, that they too have a soul. Everything, vegetation, stones, they have a soul, that despite their apparent physicality, their very existence is predicated on the spirit within them. To understand this, let's take a step back. Every experience that we experience in life has a body and a soul. There's the physical act that is happening, and then there's the content and meaning that this act is driven by. Look at the examples on page 56, right? And you can go through each example and jot down, right? What's the body and the soul of these scenarios? The first scenarios is dinner with a spouse or a close friend, or brunch or breakfast or coffee, whatever type of food interaction you like having with someone else. What's the body of this interaction? What's the soul of this interaction? When you discipline a child, there's a body and a soul to the discipline. When you exercise, there's a body and soul. When you shake hands on a deal, there's a body and a soul. Each experience we go through in life, there's a body and a soul. Take dinner with a close friend. The body is the dinner, but the soul is the relationship that's being forged with that dinner. Shaking hands on a deal, the body is the shaking the hands, but the soul of that is the context in which the shaking of the hands is coming about, that it's creating that deal. These examples are metaphors for this spiritual teaching that we learned, that sheds light on what the teaching means, and it gives us a framework to appreciate it. Because just like we know that there's meaning to everything beyond the physical properties that it has, right? There's meaning behind this dinner other than the forks, the knives, and the food that's being consumed. We can appreciate that there's a spiritual concept that underlies everything that we see and everything that we experience. Think of it in another way. Let's look at this art, this piece of art. What do we see? Some of us will see the beauty and the family gathering together. We'll feel the emotions of the wonderment in the child's eyes, looking at the father kindling the menorah. The pride on which the mother is looking at the scene. But if you look at the artwork from the technical lens, from the body lens, all that you'll see is lifeless two-dimensional lines, circles, spheres, triangles. That's all there is. It's really all a painting is just a bunch of lines and blotches and colors. But that's not what you notice when you look at a piece of art. You don't see the body of the art, you see the soul of the art. Real beautiful work of art is something that moves you and makes a deep impression of you. You don't just see the body of the art, you see the soul of the art. The world is God's canvas, and the physical matter consists of lines and shapes of God's work. But the spiritual reality, the soul of the world, is what gives shape to the world. It's the inner content and the meaning of everything that there is. Everything has a soul. Everything has meaning. Everything has purpose. That's the first message in this text. Then we have the second point, which is the soul is the source of life of every given being. Because think about the examples that we looked at before. The soul of the experiences is not just another layer that these experiences contain. It's the very premise that gives them any meaning in the first place. Excuse me. Even though in our human senses, all we can sense when shaking the hand is the physical shaking of hands, the context and meaning of the handshake is what makes it into a binding agreement. The premise, the soul of it is its essence. I can force someone to shake my hand, but it's meaningless. It's a lifeless physical gesture. The same is true for the other examples. The company is what makes the dinner worthwhile. It's not just about eating the food. And so we can think about this using the metaphor that we used in the beginning. in the text, which is the physical life of a human being. The soul isn't just another part of who we are. It's what animates us. It's our life force. It's what causes our heart to pump. It's what causes our lungs to breathe. It's what causes our brain to function. As soon as the life of the body departs, the whole body changes. It's lifeless. It stops being a person as we know it. It's no longer a person. It's just a body. The same is true in the body and soul of existence. Our physical sense can only perceive the material form of everything that exists. But once we're aware of the soul that animates it, we can understand that it's not just another deeper layer of existence, but that it's the spirit within everything is what makes it be. Everything we experience is dependent on the spiritual content that is behind it. Which brings us to the third concept expressed in this text, which is that since the spiritual content of everything is its core identity, the soul is what we should value, the spiritual content is what we should value. This is the final piece of the puzzle and perhaps the most challenging, but it flows logically from the first two steps because it's every material thing that we see and every experience that we have is animated by a spiritual content, responsible for its very form and meaning, and then B, material engagement alone is hollow, because it's like that lifeless handshake, then automatically we reach C, which is that the spiritual content of life is what we should focus on and what we should value. It flows simply, logically, A, B, C. Think of the metaphor of a person. When you talk to a person, are you talking to their nose? Are you talking to their mouth? Are you talking to their body? What are you talking to? You're not talking to their body. You're talking to their soul. You're talking to them. The them that you are communicating with is their character, the personality of a person, the soul of a person. And on a more personal note, when you think of yourself, you're not thinking of your nose, you're not thinking of your ears, you're thinking of you, your essence, your character, your consciousness. In other words, your soul. If we apply this to the world at large, we'll begin to appreciate that the world that we see, the world that we feel, the world that we sense is not what we ought to value and cherish in life. Because yes, physical matter is what fills our entire world of vision, but on its own, it's lifeless, it's meaningless, it's just the body. The real, the authentic reality that we should really value is the spiritual meaning within every object, the spiritual meaning within every experience. That's what's authentic. That's what's the depth of everything. There's a famous story of the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad Hasidism, with his young grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek, the fifth Chabad Rebbe. He was once sitting with the Tzemach Tzedek, with the fifth Chabad Rebbe. He was holding him in his lap, and his grandson said to his grandfather, Zayda, Zayda. So the Alter Rebbe turns to his grandson and he says, where's Zayda? So the grandson points to the head of the Alter Rebbe and he says, here. So the Alter Rebbe says, no, that's not Zayda, that's my head. So the child points to the Alter Rebbe's heart and he says, there's Zayda. Alter Rebbe says, no, that's not Zayda, that's my heart. And the child continues, he points to his hands, he points to his feet, he goes to different places of his grandfather, he says, this is Zayda, and each time the Zayda say, no, that's not Zayda, that's my hand, that's my feet. So the child climbs down from his grandfather's lap, and he starts walking around on his own. He goes to the door, and he pretends that his fingers get stuck in the door. And he starts screaming, Zayda, Zayda. The Alter Rebbe turns and sees the child smiling. And he says, what happened? So the child smiles and he says, oh, that's Zayda. That's the essence. It's not the head. It's not the heart. It's not the feet. It's not the hands. Zayda, when he's calling the essence of his grandfather, that is Zayda. When it comes to life, when it comes to the world around us, that's what we're looking for. And that's the meaning of this powerful verse in Deuteronomy, text 14, page 57. The verse tells us as follows: this day I call upon heaven and earth as witnesses that I have warned you, says God. I have set before you life and death, the blessing and the curse. You shall choose life so that you and your offspring will live. God's helping us, telling us, I'm giving you life and death. I'm some insider information. I'm encouraging you to choose life. Do we need God to encourage us to choose life? Do we need God to tell us that life is what's good? Isn't that obvious? Life is good. Why do we need God to encourage us that life is good and death is not? And so choose life. And the reality is, you're right. If we're talking about simple life and death, we don't need God to tell us. We know that life is good and death is not good. But based on what we learned, let's read life and death differently. Life is a reference to the life force of everything, what we're terming spirituality. And death is a reference to the material shell of everything and of all our experiences, which on their own is lifeless. Now this choice becomes a little bit more relevant and a little bit more challenging. Are we going to proceed through life valuing the material benefits and pleasures of each experience, just that death of it, the lifeless aspect of it? Or can we see life? Can we see the world? Can we see ourselves and our experiences and everything in the world and appreciate the spiritual meaning beneath it? The verse is encouraging us to choose the ultimate life, which is to see the divine spiritual meaning within every object, within every encounter, within every experience. That's what the verse is telling us. Experience the divine purpose of every object and every experience. We've had this concept shown to us in the Hasidic text. We broke it down. We visualized it. We thought about it. We analyzed it. This meditation opens up ourselves. We open ourselves to the nature of spirituality and to the possibility of experiencing the divine, and it shifts our intention of every moment in life. As that text concludes, text 15 on page 58, that text, that Hasidic concept from the discourse of 1898 concludes as follows. The Torah instructs us, love the Lord your God because he is your life. When we love ourselves, it is the state of life that our soul provides that we love, because we sense that it is our core self. By the same token, we should love God, for he is the source of life for all existence. When we meditate on the reality that divinity is the life of all life, we will desire and love God. Consequently, in all our interactions with the externality of the universe, such as eating or drinking, conducting business, and so on, our focus will shift from the material and corporeal elements to embrace the divinity within them. Now that we, hopefully, understand this concept, This concept that we just explained, where it's not about where A, everything has a soul, B, everything has a soul, and the soul is what animates it. And C, that brings us to the third level, which is that's what we ought to value. Let's take a moment, close our eyes, and for 1 minute, focus on this concept. Just this idea. Try not to let your mind wander. Try to visualize this idea in your mind. We've just experienced Jewish meditation called hitbodedut, understanding. Taking a concept, spiritual concept, studying it deeply, breaking it down, analyzing it, and then visualizing it. Now we've connected with that concept. It's penetrated our consciousness. Granted, the shift in perception won't happen overnight. We won't start suddenly seeing just the spirituality in everything, just the divinity in anything. When we look at our phones, when we look at our bottles of water, we're still going to see a bottle of water. It's going to take time, perhaps a lifetime plus, to shift our perception automatically. That when we see a water bottle, we don't see the water bottle, but rather the meaning and purpose and divinity behind it. But what we've just done is that spiritual meditation to enable us to dip our toes, to begin that level of true Jewish meditation, of hitbodedut, of connecting with the soul's perception of the world, of reaching deeply into our own spirituality by experiencing that level of spirituality. We've just experienced spirituality. This concept of hitbodedut is what Hasidic students and students of Torah have been doing for millennia. If you recall, last week we quoted a Kabbalistic, a Talmudic passage that said that the sages would spend an hour before prayer and an hour following prayer in meditation. This is what they would do. Study Kabbalistic and Hasidic concepts. Study the depth, a spiritual topic, analyze it and visualize it to become more in tune with the soul consciousness. And once they were there, they were able to pray with a proper focus. So we started this lesson with the assumption that spirituality is distant, it's intangible. But what we've discovered over the past hour plus is that not only it's not intangible and distant, but rather we can appreciate spirituality and we can make it part of our lives, a reality in our lives. And let's go back to that question we asked all the way in the beginning. How would you define spirituality, and how might spirituality be experienced? Perhaps now we have an entirely different understanding of what the term spirituality means and how we can experience it. Spirituality isn't somewhere or something specific that we need to experience. It's the recognition of the inner soul of everything that is. We don't need to do anything fancy or learn any complex ideas. To experience spirituality, we just need to open ourselves up to it. And one of the most profound ways of doing it is through meditation. Once we do so, we'll see spirituality in everything and we'll experience it constantly. It may take a long time, but we'll get there. And so what we have from today, something to take away from today's discussion, from today's hitbodedut practice, is that for spiritual meditation to have a tangible effect on your life and to open you up to the depth of living that it provides, you have to take the time to meditate regularly, whether it's daily, weekly, or even a monthly practice. Each one of us ought to take a few minutes. If you can do it daily, even better, weekly, even at least once a month, take a few minutes. Sit alone, right? The hitbodedut aspect of it, not fully, we're not transcending ourselves, we're not detaching ourselves, we're just quiet space mentally and physically. Take a few minutes and sit alone without a distraction. Take a specific spiritual idea and try to think about it in your own words. And visualize it. Close your eyes, or leave your eyes open and talk about it. Talk with yourself about it. Use the idea that we learned today in class, or something else that you learned and thought about. Question your understanding of it, analyze it, try to connect with the idea and visualize it. Think about its implications, think about its relevance. It's not easy to focus on something like this for even a few minutes, but work on it. Try to meditate regularly, which is think about a spiritual idea in your own words. And to have a spiritual idea, we got to learn Hasidus. It's available in English. If you want some suggestions, you can message me after the class and I'll give you some articles or books to begin with to study these spiritual concepts to enable us to get on that road of hitbodedut, of meditation. We'll conclude with the points of the class, following which I'll go through the questions that were posted in the chat and any other questions that some may have. Here's the key points from today's class.
Lesson 2. Mind yourself. Reflecting inward to find the divine. 1. We are comprised of a body and soul, each of which has a unique character and drive. 2. The body is driven by material gain, and the soul by spirituality. We all possess an innate spiritual drive within us that we can come to feel and experience. 3. One way to perceive the spiritual drive of the soul is by distancing ourselves from the immediate distractions of materialism. This is the root of hitbodedut meditation. 4. The most effective way to develop our spiritual calling is by learning about it and contemplating the spiritual ideas. This meditation practice is known as hitbodedut. 5. Just as we have a soul that gives us life and our true identity, the world has a soul that sustains it and is its most authentic identity. 6. We choose life by focusing on the spiritual content of every experience and valuing the divine potential within it.